Now, to break it all down and talk about the biggest trials that we are going to be watching out for, joining us now on the program is trial attorney here, Neama Rahmani. Neema, always good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Of course, Corel, thanks for having me as always.
Of course. So, Neema, I mean, you've been with us throughout so many of these major cases that broke. And I'm going to start with one of the biggest headlines of this year that was just covered in that last report, and that's Sean Diddy Combs, his arrest, now facing federal charges. But I'm going to let you take it away. Give us a recap as to what we saw regarding Diddy.
Well, huge year for Diddy and certainly not good. Really started in 2023 when Cassie Ventura filed her bombshell lawsuit in November. And that really started an influx of civil cases. But things started to go south for Combs in 2024. And it was March when his Los Angeles and Miami homes were raided. And then in May, when CNN released the video of what appeared to be a video showing him beating, kicking, punching, throwing a vase at Cassie Ventura at a hotel in Los Angeles where I live. And of course, more recently in September, he was arrested and indicted. And in May 2025, he's going to be facing a very serious federal sex trafficking trial that I fully expect to go. I don't think it's going to plead out.
So as you mentioned ahead there, in May 2025 is when we're expecting that trial to start. What more is going to happen from here till then, do you think, though? I mean, are we going to stop hearing from Diddy because the trial date has already been set? Or what kind of motions can we expect, maybe from the defense or prosecutors?
Well, I think what everyone is asking is, are other celebrities going to be brought into the case? Will there be a superseding indictment? From the prosecution's perspective, I think what may be a game changer is if we see allegations added relating to sex trafficking of minors. And the reason that's important is Diddy's defense throughout this case, through his lawyers, is that the sex happened, the freak offs happened, but they were consensual. And of course, we know that adults can consent to sex, no matter how freaky it is, but minors cannot. So if the feds do add allegations involving minors, I think that's going to really change the strategy from the defense in this case. Now, we know that Combs has dug in his heels and he is going to try this case and he's going to go after the victims. So from the prosecution's perspective, they're obviously not going to call 100 victims. Some of the victims have made inconsistent statements in their civil cases. But what are the 5, 6, 7 victims that the government thinks are the best witnesses that have stories that are going to withstand a very aggressive cross-examination by Diddy's defense team? So it's going to be interesting to see what witnesses the government puts up in the case.
Moving on to the next trial that we are looking ahead to in 2025, that against Luigi Mangione. And this story is one of these end of the year stories. It started in the beginning of December. It was December 4th, I believed, when that United Healthcare CEO was murdered just outside his hotel at Midtown Manhattan. And it has actually exploded. I mean, so many headlines coming out of this. Neema, let's recap once again here for our audience. What do we know? How did this start?
So this was what would normally be a typical murder, when murder shouldn't be typical, but unfortunately, in a city like New York, they are. But it really took a very interesting direction because of the nature of the victim. He was the CEO of United Healthcare, and the alleged murderer, Luigi Mangione, had a manifesto that really sort of described this distrust and this dislike of the health insurance industry. And we're watching the video right now of what appears to be an assassination. Now, here's someone who's not your typical murder defendant. He's, by all accounts, very smart, Ivy League graduated, valedictorian of his school, comes from a very wealthy family. And it's not something that you typically see. And what's really atypical about this case, and I've been doing this more than 20 years, Carl, I've never seen a defendant accused of murder that has this much sympathy on social media. If you go on Instagram or TikTok or any platform, there are some people that think he's a hero. And the reason I think this case is going to go to trial in 2025, even though we don't have a trial date yet, is he's represented by Karen Friedman, who, of course, is married to Mark Agnifilo, who's representing Diddy. Not to say that the cases are similar, but because of the potential juror sympathy factor in this case and the real possibility of jury nullification, I think his lawyer is going to want to take advantage of that, push this case to trial as quickly as possible. Because if you're defending the case on the merits, we've all seen the video. There's DNA, there's fingerprint evidence, the ballistic evidence from the 3D printer, his own words in the manifesto that really put him at or near the scene and show the motive. So it's going to be a tough case to defend to say that he didn't do it. But because the district attorney's office, I think, foolishly has brought in a terrorism charge, it really opens the door to evidence as to why he did it. And I think jurors are going to hear a lot about the health insurance industry. And, maybe one of them or two of them have frustrations about it. And they may vote to acquit, notwithstanding the avalanche of evidence against Mangione.
So, Nima, you did mention that we don't have a trial date set just yet regarding this case. So what more needs to happen in order for this to head to trial?
So there's actually two cases happening simultaneously, which again is not typical. The feds and the state are prosecuting Mangione at the same time. This has also led some people to believe that prosecutors are piling on, and this case has taken on a whole political component. Now, normally the feds will go first. I'm not sure that's going to happen here because the state filed first. But again, typically you don't see this. The Department of Justice's own policy, it's called the Pettit policy, says that the state files first. The feds normally don't file on top of that unless there is a compelling federal interest that isn't vindicated in the state case. So what does that mean? We've seen two recent cases where there have been state and federal prosecutions. One was Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd, and the other was the McMichaels and Roddy Bryan for the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. Now, there was civil rights components in that case, obviously not here. So it's going to be interesting to see which judge sets the trial date first, but I fully expect Mangione's lawyers to not waive time and assert their right to a speedy trial.
And then finally, Nima, the third trial that you and all of us have our eye on in 2025 is a case that really we have been covering for years now. And this is against Brian Kohberger. Now, he is accused and officially been charged with the murder of students from the University of Idaho. But if our audience hasn't kept up so much, or I mean, there's been so many trials, Nima. Let's get a breakdown and overview on the charges that Kohberger is facing. Why is he going to trial?
So this is one of the most gruesome murders in Idaho state history, maybe even recent memory. These are four University of Idaho college students who were stabbed and killed. And this case has been pending for quite some time. So a different type of case. It's a death penalty case. And the lawyers there are taking a much more cautious approach. They filed motion after motion. And again, this is a case I flagged because we know the vast majority of cases don't go to trial. They plead out about 98%. But this case is absolutely going to go to trial, just like Mangione and just like Sean Diddy Combs. And the reason is obviously he's facing the death penalty. But also, here's someone who is not your typical accused murderer. He was very careful in terms of covering up his tracks. Now, allegedly, we're talking about a very gruesome murder scene, and there's really only one single source of DNA in the knife sheath. So the defense is going to argue that it was planted. They're also going to challenge the methodology of the DNA there. So normally when you have a murder like this, and we're seeing the home where the students lived in being destroyed, because it has been years, you would normally expect to see a lot more evidence. And we're also seeing some of the cell site evidence. I mean, this is someone that was sophisticated enough to either turn off his phone or put it in airplane mode when he was traveling. Obviously, we're seeing the video of the FBI pulling him over. Ultimately, they were able to identify Kohberger only because they got DNA from his father. So it's going to be a very interesting case in terms of the forensics that comes in. There's been a gag order, a very broad gag order in the case. So law enforcement isn't talking, prosecutors, the defense aren't talking, even the witnesses, the victims aren't allowed to talk in this case. So it's going to be interesting to see what evidence comes out at trial, because again, normally I would expect for a murder this gruesome for there to be a lot more evidence.
And then, Nima, just finally here, out of these three trials that we have spoken about here, Diddy, Mangione, Kohberger, is there any one of these cases where you think that perhaps the defense has an edge based on what we've seen so far, evidence-wise?
Evidence-wise, I think the strongest case is against Mangione, but the sympathy factor looms large. I think that is a case I would watch because I've never seen a case that has this much of a risk of jury nullification, maybe since OJ. And OJ was a different type of case. Obviously, the jurors did not like the LAPD and how they handled that investigation and the racism. Um, I'm not saying that OJ was acquitted because of sympathy for him, but just because of the sympathy that Mangione has received, broad sympathy, I think that is probably the riskiest case from a prosecution perspective. I think Diddy is going to be overwhelmed with the number of victims who come testify. And I think it's going to be tough for him to argue that all of the acts were consensual. Jurors might not believe one or two or three victims, but when victim after victim testifies and tells the same story of physical and sexual violence, I think that's going to be tough. And I expect in the Diddy case there to be a lot of video evidence as well. And then with respect to Kohberger, it's still up in the air. Potentially, there's a possibility of a mistrial or not guilty, but I think the fact that the prosecution has had so long to prepare, I think in that case, the defense is just going to try to keep him alive, keep him off death row. I don't think they have a real chance of an acquittal there.
Neama Rahmani, attorney here. You join us so much, of course, covering all of these cases. And as we see here, there's a lot more to get to when we get to 2025. So we'll be seeing you then.
I'm sure. Thanks so much for having me.